Now,
Go ahead.
yeah, with your parents, like same thing like we did with Irving.
I mean,
your parents.
Well, my parents were
We're overjoyed when I
No, but they're both from Poland, right? Both from the same town
yeah.
in Poland.
They all came from the suburbs
The same
of Warsaw.
vicinity. Like
And
Obernier.
they were all from these were suburbs of Warsaw. They could walk to Warsaw. they told me.
Krasnishilds. Was it Krasnishilds?
Krasnishilds.
There was a Schiltz, there was a Krasnishilds, there was Makaba. These were all suburbs, but they don't exist.
So Avram Pesach, who was he married to?
Sure.
Shurivka Silverberg. She was 19, he was 18. It was 1881 when the Tsar Nicholas II was assassinated, and they could not have music at their wedding because music was prohibited the year of mourning. My grandfather, Avram Pesach,
Mick.
was
Look at the,
was in charge of a farm, but this portion of the farm grew just onions. Onions in Yiddish is Sibila. So they gave him a name, the Tsibilash, because he was in charge of the onion patch. You can imagine that he didn't make very much, being in charge of the onion patch. So and there were cousins and an aunt, an old aunt, who lived in America. And when they came here, I don't know. But he came here without his family, he alone, a solo trip, to overlook and see what possibilities.
Not overlook, look over.
Look over and see what possibilities he would have here. And he thought he could probably do better. So he went back to Europe, he got his family together, and he took not only the 3 children and his wife, but friends said, "Oh, I'm from Pesach, I can't come in, I don't have anyone to back me. Can we come in as your children?" They were friends of his children. And he took them.
you know who that was?
Zelda Rosen.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and her
Oh.
2 children. They came in as Avram Pesach's children. Don't lose it.
So when Avram Pesach migrated to America, he had 3 children. The 3 older children, 3 younger ones were born here. And the 3 older ones we know are Leah, Albert, and Rosie. 1 man and 2 women. And then the younger siblings were Patty, Morris, and Ida. 2 boys and 1 girl. Anyway, when he migrated here, it turns out he had a brother who had migrated earlier, and his name was Rosenthal. And so Avram Pesach felt, this is the way I understand it, that it's pasnished, it's not proper. Here he comes here and he'll settle here in America. And his brother's name is Rosenthal, and his name is Rugel, or however it's pronounced. So he decided to continue with the name Rosenthal. And that's how that came
And
about.
also there was an older aunt who acted as hostess to the family as they came in. And she said, "You ought to Americanize your name from Rugel to Rosenthal."
So that's a good American Jewish name, Rosenthal, not Rugel. And as a matter of fact, years later, Patty gave it a little French twist, and he adopted the name of Rugel.
There was a whole clan of friends, and she married some. They were, I guess, men went after my mother.
Was a
They, my dad went for her, this other man, and there were a whole group of friends.
I was wondering if you think that was in part the fact that she wanted to marry so young, against her parents' wishes, and the fact that she wanted to get married when she came here, in a way that she was expressing independence in a very chauvinist world, wanting to get out of the influence of her father by getting married.
Maybe, I don't know what it was, but I guess she had a lot of suitors.
Mm-hmm.
Because this man, TB was a common disease that killed a lot of people, and this man had, shortly after they were married,
He died?
he died. And there was my father was there weeping away because he was also a suitor. His father wrote to my father saying, there's a younger sister who was never married, and she's Rose, and very nice. Why are you going for the older one who has a son?
Writing to Henry.
Yeah. But he said...
Rose was a very good-looking woman.
Yeah.
So the story we always heard was that Henry, in a way, admired her even in Poland. Even in Poland.
Maybe. He told me, he remembered when the wedding took place.
Right.
The whole town turned out to look and get a view of what was the ceremony that was taking place.
With your mother and the rabbi? That were sort of carried over, that were powerful in the family.
Hushed Up was my mother's first marriage. That was hushed. Not to Harry, but to the whole family. Nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah.
And
For
Midge
years, I didn't know the fact.
and Midge always said to me.
Midge is his daughter, right?
Yeah, one of the
Harry's
three.
daughter.
She said to me in the last few years, she said, you know, we never could get my father's background. If we asked questions, he didn't deny, he didn't explain, he didn't talk about it. He didn't answer. So she said after a while we stopped asking. But she said we really never knew anything. And that was about the only hushed up. Brought my mother, and Harry was 4, and Al was about 11. And there was Rose, and then there was Leah, and Sarah Rifka, my grandmother.
They came straight to New York?
Yeah, and they remained in New York.
Where? Lower East Side?
Lower East Side.
Except
the first night or two, they stayed at this aunt's house. And my mother would describe that night, the first thing they gave immigrants when they came in was a laxative. That was, and there was no toilet in the apartment. And they all slept on the floor with this aunt couldn't put everybody up. So she said that was a night she'll never forget. And then they went out on their own, and each of the children started to work. My mother started to work. Rose started. Al was a little bit young for going to work.
How old was Avram Pesach when he immigrated? When the family came?
You can figure back. He was married in 1881, and he was 18 years old.
Right.
They came here in 1903.
Right.
It's 18 years ago.
How much?
Okay.
81 is 19 and 3.
Okay, so he was close. So he was
years.
close to 40 years old, around 40 years old.
22.
And did he work when he came here?
Yeah, he looked for something to do. And then he ended up, I remember his having a bread stand. It was like having a stand in a flea market. It was on the corner of Hester and Ludlow. On that corner, there was a a wooden table, and on that table was all his inventory, all the bread. Bakers would come and deliver bread to him. He would sell it to the passers-by.
And the breads were sometimes good-sized
Oh,
breads, and people would buy a
The
section
breads
of them.
were larger than this plate.
Wow. Were
And
they
he
like,
would-
were they like challahs or?
Friday,
okay.
Thursday and Friday were challah, but big cornbreads and big pumpernickel, but heavy pumpernickel. And people from Westchester, the few who had cars would come to the Lower East Side to buy merchandise, buy food. And a stop at the bread stand was a very, very common thing. And that's how he had enough money to support his family.
Do you have any idea how much a loaf of bread then might have cost?
Yeah, Patty in the article said old bread was a day-old bread was a penny.
My dad, when he was, in those years, you didn't have to have, if you had 2, 3, 4 years of elementary education, you could read and write. That was adequate, for a poor family. And so my dad, like the women, worked in the garment industry. That was one of the main industries that supported all these millions of Jews who lived in lower Manhattan. And he used to carry a sewing machine on his back, and that's how you had to own your own sewing machine. And so he only went to maybe the 3rd or 4th grade, and that was enough. He had to go to work.
Do you know where he went to school?
On the Lower East Side. Where, I don't know.
Some of the other children went to school at the Seward Avenue.
That's why I went to Seward Park.
Yeah, but so did
Seward
the
Park
others.
High School.
They did?
Yeah, they went to the elementary schools.
My dad ended up being a traveling salesman in the Midwest.
Wow.
And he had a horse and buggy, and he used to go around through Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. He had a tour, a route. And they would go, and maybe once a month he'd come to farmers and take orders. He had pots and pans, clothing, and all sorts of things. And then he would deliver it on his next trip around. And on his honeymoon, when he married my mother, whom he knew from prior to having left New York, on their honeymoon they went. She went with him on the route, and they settled in Minnesota. Not in St. Paul, but in a smaller town.
Do you know how they met?
How they met?
Yeah.
Oh, they met in New York because
of your father?
Naomi and my father knew.
Look over there.
My father and Naomi and his parents knew the Avram Pesach in Europe. So when they came to this country, my father's father said, "Here is Avram Pesach and the address is in New York, and go look him up,
So
and
the
you can
families-
probably stay there.
The families were acquainted.
And you can probably stay there until you get settled." So my father did that. Naomi came a little later. She did that. And they were all the same age as my mother, as
The
Al.
families were well acquainted. And
And
the women all did the same thing. They worked in the garment industry. Rosie made buttonholes, and I don't know,
my mother did.
and your mother
Made
did.
buttonholes on
And
men's.
Henry, her dad, ended up in the embroidery business.
Right. My father was the artist in the family.
He was what's called an all-rightnik.
And all right.
That means he was getting upper class.
In the
All right.
economic.
They called it an all-rightnik. He was
I
doing
thought
fairly
all
It's
right.
the
well.
equivalent of a yuppie.
They
Irving.
lived in 97th Street in Manhattan.
But I thought an all right.
Elevator building in those days.
But I thought an all rightnik referred to your economic status.
Yes.
Yeah,
You
that's,
had more money than some of the others.
Yeah.
that's what I said, an
Oh,
all-rightnik.
okay.
Irving, what year your parents got married?
Boy, if Harold is 6 years older than I was, so I was born in 1919.
Who was 6 years older?
Harold.
He was older than Micky, too.
He was 2
Yeah.
years older than I was.
So what year were you born?
I have to tell you. 1915.
So Harold was born in 1913, and there
In,
was another child
in-
that had a
in
stillborn.
Warsaw, in Warsaw during the war. It was
Harold was
probably closer to 13, 14, because Naomi couldn't get back to this country. World War I broke out.
She was anxious.
So why
I
was
don't-
she went back to Warsaw to visit?
To
Yes.
visit her parents.
I don't know if
was
she knew she
pregnant.
was pregnant or not. She
Yes.
probably did.
She knew she was pregnant, and she said to Al, and whatever she said to Al was holy.
She wanted to see her parents before she had a baby.
Because if the baby, I'll never get back to see my mother and father. Her mother was pretty sick.
Anyway,
Do you
as
know,
it
do you know
turned
her
out,
mother and father's names?
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
His name was
Fievel.
Fievel, Brock, and her name was
Hannah.
Hannah.
And we never knew her. She died before.
No, she died, and then
We never
he,
knew her.
he came here.
Then,
to
as a
the country.
result of her death, my mother. That's what really brought us from St. Paul to New York. My
back
mother,
again,
My mother
because
felt
she knew
that she wanted her father to come and she would look
and
after him.
the oldest sister, Chava.
And so she didn't want her father to come to Minnesota. She wanted
She
her
knew he'd have
No,
nothing
that
to
would
do
be
with it.
nothing. He was a very religious Orthodox Jew, and even he lived, I don't know, for another 8, 10, 12 years here.
With
he
her,
never
with
spoke, he never learned any English.
But you
He
guys
only
knew him.
mingled with other Jews.
So you knew him?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure, he lived
sure.
with us. So here you wear a mask, and Zayda would want to. We had him try it on, Zayda. Well, and we gave him a sword, and we used to fence in the house. So he would have to tuck it in, and because he was a short little man, but a very nice personality. He was less authoritarian than Avram Pesach. Of course, Avram Pesach was the head of a family, and they all lived together, and he was the head of the household. But he was different. He was a mild mannered, but a Gelernte. They had everybody who knew him had a lot of respect for his knowledge of the Talmud.
Who?
I think.
Avraham Pesach.
He went to
Fievel or
he
Avram?
went to
Fievel.
a shtibel in Warsaw with the Zionist. I'm trying to think of his name.
Who? Fievel?
Yeah, Fievel.
Really?
And when he came here, he was very put out that my father wasn't Orthodox.
He wasn't Orthodox enough for him.
Wasn't Orthodox for anybody. So
What do you
he
mean for anybody?
he
was
thought.
a good Jew. Avram Pesach observed.
Oh, I'm from not my father. My father.
Oh, Henry, his son.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. He was
So,
very unhappy.
He was very unhappy, and he felt that this Zionist, one of the early Zionists, name a few,
Nordau?
Nordau. Max Nordau went to Stiebel with Fievel,
No,
and
it
he
couldn't have been Max Nordau.
All right, what's the difference?
Max Nordau was a very wealthy European.
anyway, this was an internationally known Zionist, and
Jabotinsky?
Brenner?
Fievel decided that he will remind him, he'll go meet him, he'll remind him they went to school together, and if this Zionist would influence my father to be Orthodox. Naomi and my grandfather, who was an authority in the household,
You're talking about Avraham Pesach.
yeah, tried to break up some of the marriages, or the to-be marriages,
Oh,
that
the
the
boys.
children, the boys,
Oh.
including Al and Naomi.
So Sarah
That I
and
never
Abraham tried to do
Yeah.
that.
He
Sarah.
thought that Naomi.
Maybe you don't have to
You said
tell him that
Naomi.
I
now.
never heard of that.
You mean Sarah and Abraham tried to do that?
They weren't
You
happy.
said
with-
Naomi and-
Avram. Before the marriage.
What didn't they like about Naomi?
She was sick. Naomi was always sickly. My grandfather knew that. And she remained always with ailments. While they were courting, he tried to break it up. And Naomi never forgave that, because they, of course, did get married over his influence, his efforts and attempts to break it up.
Go back. Can you go back for 1 second though? When your parents got married,
Yeah.
that's when. So your father brought Naomi to Minnesota,
on the honeymoon. So
but he was still living there.
Yes,
he was living and working there, and then it was decided that they would live in Minnesota. And on the honeymoon, he had a horse and buggy, and he took her on his part of his route one year to see what he does.
they stayed there
it was
quite
only,
a while.
Yeah.
He'd go on, say, for a week or so. They lived in a
Harold-
small town, different. But when Harold was born, she went to Europe and got trapped in World War I, and he didn't know anybody in the family except his mother and the relatives in Europe. And, well, this is another story, I'll tell it now. And when he came, he only spoke Yiddish, not English. And,
And he
they
was
said,
5? How old was
huh?
he? How old was he?
4
4?
He was 3 years old, I think.
when you came.
When they came. I don't know. He was very young. And so when they introduced him, they said, "This is your father." Here at Ellis Island, the whole family gathered to find my mother with her new baby. And he said, "Nein," he only spoke Yiddish. "Nein, no, this is nicht mein Tate. Mein Tate is in Beitel. My father is in your pocketbook." There was a photograph of that was his father. Well, I was very young when we left Northfield, which was the town where Harold was brought up. He was the only child, although my mother had a couple of stillborn girls.
How many?
2. I don't know the sequence. One was older than Harold would have been, and one was younger. Sandy was the baby of the family. And it so happens that just as the same as with Harold, when she was pregnant with me, and at that time we lived in Northfield, it was decided that that she should come to New York to have the baby. This is where all the relatives are. So my dad had a little business there. He had a store. We have a nice photograph of him in that store. And so I was born at Coney Island Hospital, and then a few weeks later they went back to Northfield.
Oh wow.
Then when I got to be maybe, I don't know, I think she told me he was 2 or 3 years old, they moved to St. Paul, which was a good-sized city. And we lived, I still remember, I think it was Fairmount Avenue, we had a nice place.
All right.
And
Just
my
a
father was a member of the temple, and every day of my life, I mean, maybe I didn't go when I was 3 years old, but he took me to shul every Shabbos, every
Your
Saturday
father
morning.
went to shul every
In
All right, now,
Minnesota.
no,
Wait a minute, let me finish. And to this day, I can still remember, wait a minute, don't tell me. When people can stand up at the end of the service and start to fold their talis, the talesim, what do they sing? Adon Olam Asher Mola. And when that song would break out, I was so happy because we were going home.
I felt the same way.
There are generations of kids who feel the same way.
So as a 7 or 8 year old, I knew it was time to go home.
While the boys were home, Morris and Patty, they would daven every morning and put on film in respect to
Morris and Patty did?
Yes, in respect, I know because I stayed overnight all the time. In respect to Avram Pesach. But then Avram Pesach was a very sharp and bright man, and he say, Simchala, his Yiddish name was Simcha. Simchala, you wink, in Yiddish, you wink to God.
Yeah, well.
Who was Simcha? Which one?
When I was sleeping, I dreamt a pleasant dream. Dream I was flowing all down.
Where would you do Shabbat?
Where'd you live?
Right, Avram
In
Pesach.
Brooklyn.
Always. Always at Avram.
What was Avram Pesach's last name?
Rosenthal.
Well, Rogil was something
Pesach.
like Rogan.
Avram Pesach.
Rosenthal.
But he said the last name. It would have been in Europe. If they had remained in Europe, it would have been Rogel, but he didn't want to embarrass his
So
brother.
how many
brothers.
people at a Shabbat dinner? The Shabbos
20,
dinner?
25.
Oh, we had a lot. Yeah,
Every
that's
week.
a good thing to talk about.
20, 25
It was a
people.
very well
I
attended.
remember it.
All the
Are
children
you running this meeting or not?
are not all the children that those years. Patty wasn't married, was he?
No.
Patty
Oh.
wasn't married.
No, he lived in sin.
But Lee and Henry had 2 daughters.
This
My
says it
folks-
very well.
My folks had 3 children, and Morris and Esther weren't married
No,
either. This was before. So who was at the house of the younger kids?
They
Anyway,
all had friends. And,
Yeah, they would bring a lot of friends.
and as he says in this article, that it was open house for the friends. And I
And
remember,
they always had a guest for Shabbos.
So you were always there,
I was always there.
Every
and so
Friday
it
night.
would be unheard of not to go. It would be offensive.
Well, no,
No.
I'm sure we missed some Friday nights for
Sometimes.
some reason. We lived,
And
we
my
lived in
folks
Brooklyn also.
often couldn't make it for reasons that my dad had a bit, by that time, no embroidery, had a retail, he had to stay open, you know.
But it was
But if they couldn't go, I went by subway myself to the Lower East Side, and I spent the weekend, every weekend. I sat in awe
you spend the weekend where?
at Zayd and Bubba's.
But the Shabbos evenings, Friday night that I'm talking about, they lived in Brooklyn.
No, they're never in Brooklyn.
What are you talking about?
Later on,
They
when
lived
they,
near the Silverbergs.
later on,
Yeah.
that was
All right.
much later.
I remember that it
When
was
you
a
were
very.
in St. Paul,
It was well, no, I'm talking about later when we moved. But it was a very happy Friday night dinner.
Can you,
And one thing, Patty and Morris, but primarily Patty, he always had some little trinkets for the kids. He'd stick his hand, or we would put our hands in his pocket. He had balloons and little things. And they always had stories to tell, jokes. And they were terrific. The Zmiras they would sing were their own variety. I went to the animal fair, that sort of thing. We would think,
Or-
you know, we had a more modern
Negro
Zmiras,
spiritual.
Really?
went to the
No animal fair.
the birds and bees
Birds
were
were
there,
there.
and the old
I can't remember the words.
and the monkey he
He
got
got
drunk,
on-
and he
sat
sat
on
in the elephant's trunk.
trunk.
And
The elephant sneezed and fell on his knees, and what became of the monkey?
Then we'd sing it as around, monk, the monk, the monk, the monk, the monk,
monk,
and
the
somebody
monk.
else sang. But
I remember those.
there was a different one.
When they had the high holiday services, Morris was
No,
the...
No.
that's something else.
He
No,
was-
okay, okay.
Morris was the chazan.
He was the
a trained
Would he
chazan.
get paid more than the people in the choir?
People in the choir got paid nothing.
They
So who
were-
was making
What
money?
did they pay me, a
Who was
12,
making
13-year-old
money?
kid? I wouldn't have been
Morris
paid.
was making money.
And my grandfather
And
gave him
Zeta
the-
made some money on it, but other than that, it was a business for Zeta and Morris.
Yeah,
You
and
guys were the
What about
slave
your
labor.
father?
What about your father, if he came up with the idea?
No, he didn't.
Irv, did your Zeta pay taxes on that money they made?
No.
no,
Well, you did the income tax, you should know.
Huh? I don't know.
sure enough.
But a sideline about Morris, that Morris had as an income, he couldn't make a living being a chazan. I think Zeta would have liked it, and I think he would have done it if he could.
They wanted him to go to the seminar.
That would be a more better training. And I'll never forget the Uberbett, these big
Feather quilts.
feather quilts that we slept in. Anyway, we were there just a night or two. So the first time we slept there, and Harold came running in. Mother, quick, come to the kitchen. There are animals in the kitchen. There were cockroaches. He had never seen a cockroach. So that was one of the stories. that
Broken
come up.
hearted as Hawkins County jail. All my friends stand round to wonder
I
where
would say it was a
mobile.
typical household of a male chauvinist Jewish family. He was a very authoritarian, but he wasn't mean. But he was the head of the family, and Surah Rivka was in the kitchen cooking. And Surah Rivka, bring the fish some tish, bring in this, and he would give orders to, you know.
Did you think it was strange then?
Well,
or looking
no,
back?
what do I know?
Were
It was
they
a kid.
loving? I mean, was she a kind of person you could sit on her lap? I mean, were they?
Oh,
How would you
well,
describe them?
Let me
my
tell you.
grandmother had very thick lips, and when she gave you a kiss, I'll always remember that it was a very wet kiss. So what I did say was, to Don before, I think I was trying to say, was the political left-wing influence of Esther as transmitted to her through her parents who had a radical background, brought radicalism into the family. And me as a young teenager, I was radical and absorbed some of it, and so did Sandy. And Harold, I don't know, he did too, but
Oh, sure he did.
yeah, but not.
Tell them about some of your life after her.